in Spanish because I'm trying to learn Spanish and I can't find the words anymore. Okay, so let's get started. I started recording. And today the concept is for us to guide through and talk through a little bit of the suggestions to how you would structure the writing of your introduction for a paper. And this is kind of important because it's an introduction for a paper, it's not the introduction for a grant, and it's not the introduction for a proposal. I think they kind of structured a little differently here and there. So this is for a paper. And here what I'm showing you is the current template we have for introduction writing, which would give you the structure and would give you some suggestions. And this is kind of how we want to make templates for introduction, templates for writing, but also templates for methods writing and templates for analysis. So here we have the structure of how we see the introduction. But before I go into this, I also wanted to mention that as we build out this concept of having 4 touch point meetings at the development of a project, the idea is that at every meeting, you kind of increment a little bit what you're doing on your work. So for the first meeting, even though you don't have a full fleshed out introduction, you should be able to come up with the outline of that introduction. And that's kind of what I want to build with you here, is just going through any particular project we're going to do and then create an outline for the introduction for that particular project. So you can see how you can come up with an introduction idea just from your minds in the first day of the project, and then you kind of increment it as you go and improve the project flow. But so to give you a concept, the way we think about this is that for writing, the same way that we have for methods, we do have a structure to follow. So it basically means that you're not just writing up the ideas, you're kind of following a structure and you're fitting the ideas within the structure, because this structure is a structure that we've learned it helps organize the thought in a way that it's easier to put them into a narrative compared to just writing what other methods do. So some scientific courses will teach you to do this kind of introduction writing as if you were doing copy and pasting and pieces of ideas together, and then you organize a flow, a narrative. I particularly don't like that very much because you end up copying and pasting too many different ideas, and then it's harder for you to write a narrative. I like this model, and this model is a model that we've been using in our group for many years, and it's proven to be very successful. Because this model allows us to center the writing into a question. So it's more like a target-focused writing instead of doing a branch writing and then circling back to the structure knowledge. So how does it work? And here on the template, I've linked out 3 videos. If I find more, I'll find more. I talked about this a lot. So you have here me talking about this applied to systematic reviews, both in English and Portuguese. Here's a video on YouTube from a faculty that was my mentor when I trained at Duke. So the video is still here. And I think it's a good one to explain the concept. But the idea is that the introduction has 4 pieces, 4 structures you're going to write your ideas around. And so it has 4 key components. The 4 components are significance, the information gap, the literature review in support of the gap, and then the objectives and hypotheses. The idea is that you're going to organize your thought process in these 4 structures, because they're going to guide you to writing your introduction in a narrative way. So what are these structures? The first one, the significance, is where you start the project and you highlight the importance of the problem. So here on the template, we give you this definition. I'm going to read it out because I want you to follow what we have here on the template. But the idea is that the significance is going to be usually 1 paragraph. Sometimes it can be 2, depending on how much time in the text you need to get to the point. But ideally, you want to make it 1 paragraph, 1 very concise and 1 very direct paragraph. And this paragraph follows that idea of going from broad to specific, but not so broad and not too specific. It has to be followed on the narrative. So the first paragraph should state why the topic is important. And the statement of how it's important should be convincing enough so that the readers are interested in what they are reading. I, in particular, like to say that, I'm going to add some wording here. The statement has to convince readers that they should keep reading the manuscript since it's relevant. I'm going to change this and say another way of seeing this. Another way of seeing this is that the reader should feel anxious about the topic. This first paragraph should be generating anxiety that later you will address with your study. So I like to think about this paragraph as the paragraph that is anxiety generating. You're giving a bunch of facts to make them feel like, well, this is really a problem. This is really important. And so here, there's a few advices that I think are very important in how we write this, is that it's advisable to give readers information such as number of people that are affected or financial impact. So usually what we're trying to show here is using statistics about the area, meaning numbers, that can have people relate when they are trying to explain the importance of that. So in this paragraph, you don't want to say a statement that is very common sense, such as depression is a problem that affects a lot of people in the world. It's a significant statement, but it's not a statement that make you relate to that. You want to give it some more guidance, and you want to say something like, depression is one of the highest burden, is one of the diseases with the highest contribution to the global burden of disease, affecting 1 out of 10 people in whatever condition, in whatever community. So you're giving numbers so that when you give a number and you say 1 out of 10, it's much more impressive than you say 10% or a lot of people, right? So you want to be specific. You want to give numbers to it. Here we have an example from a paper we got. And then it goes and says, the verticular disease is one of the most common disorders in the colon in elderly population. So it's saying that it's very common. In North America, about 1/3 of people older than 45 and 2/3 of people older than 85 have this disease. 1/2, which leads approximately to 2,100 hospitalizations in the US. So you've made the problem very specific and very relatable. Okay? Yes, Kiana?
Quick question. So when you say integers are better than percentages, is that discipline specific?
No, it's not. It's just the sense that when you say 10%, it's different than saying 1 out of 10 for the reader. It's more like a psychological thing, because if you say 1 out of 10, then I can look around in a room and say, well, there's 10 people in the room, 1 of them must be depressed. While if I say 10%, 10% feels like, well, it's not a lot, right? 10% out of 100%, it's just a small portion, that's fine. So it creates less urgency, right? So here in this text, when they say 1/3, 2/3, later I like it very much because they translate that to a large number. And I think that that's important. So if you're going to say, well, I have a disease that have a 5% prevalence, that doesn't seem too much. So you might say like, yeah, that's not really relevant. But then you say, well, and that reflects to this amount of hospitalizations in the world that cost the health system this amount of money. It becomes important, right? So that's the rationale. If you don't have integers to share, you can share prevalences. It depends on who is reading the document. But you always want to try to give this sense of urgency on what people are reading.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I like I should have an example here from one of our snakebite projects, because when you talk about snakebite, you see the mortality of snakebite in the Amazon, which is the highest mortality place in the country, is small. It's not up to 5%, 10%, which is great. But when you're making that argument, people are going to say, well, that's not a big problem. And I say, yes, it's not a big problem. However, all people that are dying are from minority populations. So Black people have 5 times more likelihoods of chances of dying than white people if they're bitten by a snake. So I turned this small percentage into something that is meaningful to whoever I'm trying to read this. So that's what the significance is about. I also like to think that the significance should always end with a statement that is leading to the gap, right? Because that's the second part of the introduction, which is likely the most important part of the introduction. What is the information gap? Every scientific project needs to have a gap they are trying to fill, a gap of evidence. That's what we write in the introduction. If you're doing a study that is just going to reiterate what the literature already knows, then you're likely not doing a study at all. So the gap needs to be very clear. And the gap is usually something when you say, there's information missing in the science, I'm going to fill this gap. So the significance should lead to that. And the gap, I really like the way Ricardo used to discuss this. And he says, imagine you're invited to do a trip, but the person who invited you do not inform the destination. So you're not going to enjoy the ride because you're worrying, trying to figure out where it's going. Now, if the reader is reading a paper and they have no clear idea where you're going to, because by the end of the introduction, you're going to say, this is what I'm trying to feel, then you're going to have the reader trying to find, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about all of these different things? But I also like to make the argument that if you go out on a trip and you don't have a clear map of where you're going to go, you're probably going to take the wrong turns and follow a wrong path. So if you don't have a very clear idea of what is the gap you are writing about, then there's a very high chances that you're going to write stuff in the introduction that are not relevant. And I can tell you, most of the problems in introduction writing that I find when I reviewing papers is people bringing background information that are not relevant to the study and just points you to different directions. So imagine I'm doing this work on diverticular disease, and now I start showing what are the other prevalences of other NCDs out there, which has no meaning to me unless I want to make a comparison to diverticular disease. But honestly, I don't care, right? So finding the gap and having a clear gap at the beginning of the writing of your introduction will help you not miss the lane, not get the wrong turn, and get to the point where you want to get. So for the reader of the article, and that's the idea, if you don't inform, then they're going to get confused on what they're reading. I think that I really like this, and this section should state in a very clear way that there's an important information gap. Some folks would initially say, you should say things like, there is a gap in the literature on this area. I don't like that very much. I do like to say stuff like, even though we know a lot about this disease, we do not know about this thing. So here in the example, they say, in 1991, Fowler and White performed one of the earliest laparoscopic sigmoid, blah, 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 blah. More than a decade later, however, the benefits of this are still controversial. This is a gap statement, right? This makes it very clear that this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the benefits of this treatment characteristic here. Okay? So the gap should be very, very, very clear in your writing. And here you have just 2 sentences. So this means that this gap could be tied to the first paragraph, or you can have a full paragraph for the information gap. That's fine. It can go with the way you're writing, but it should come early on. I don't like it when it comes later and people that leave it to the end of the introduction. okay? And why this is important? Because the significance is giving the background that guides to the gap. And then once you know the gap, the literature review you're going to provide is always going to be in support to the gap. And that for me is very important because I see a lot of papers where people keep dumping literature and showing a bunch of evidence about a bunch of things, but not tying it clearly to what the question is. So when I'm doing a literature review and I write 2 sentences or a paragraph around something, I always end the literature paragraph saying, all of this has been done, but none of them have shown the gap. So in the case here, if the gap is that the benefits of LSR are still controversial, I would then say, give a bunch of information saying how the benefits, how researchers showed benefits, but some researchers showed that there are not benefits, and the benefits have been explored in ways using methods A, B, and C, but yet nobody has shown clearly the benefits of this treatment, or the controversy is still undecided. I would always end the statement with something that calls back to the gap. Okay? So literature review is always related back to the gap. And then finally, you have your hypothesis. So the structure then is, here's the significance. This is why this is important. But this is what we haven't done. This is what we have done that highlights why we haven't done is important and justifies that what haven't been done needs to be done. And then here's what I'm going to do. And that's what the objectives and hypotheses are. A few things that are important here. As I mentioned, in the significance, you always want to center on numbers. You always want to use numbers to highlight what you're trying to say. In the information gap, you always want to make it very clear what is the gap. You don't want to hint it. You want to make it clear. If you feel like you need to say, this is the gap, say it. Because it's important for you to specify that this is what you're targeting. This is what you want to do. Now, the literature review should always be around the gap. And on the literature review, there's something that's very important that I've seen people do, is that you always want to cite the data. You never want to cite the argument. I've seen many papers that I reviewed in the past months where people were citing in the literature review a paper that I wrote that I never looked at that data in particular. So they were citing me. For instance, they were citing a paper that I published with Cyrus on TBI modeling and saying a good strategy to address problems in class unbalancing is smooth approaches, is smooth smoothing. And then they cite our paper. And then I know that I've never studied to say that this is the good approach to address machine learning problems in unbalancing classes. What I did is I used that method. But so my paper is not about that evidence. I am making that claim in the paper methods, and somebody citing me as a way to support the statement. That's not good practice. If they want to if they want to cite something that is going to support that, they have to find a paper that tested the methodology and then cite that paper, or they can change the statement and say, SMOT is good for class unbalancing, and it has been used before. And then you cite the paper, because then that's okay, I used it, okay? That's very important. I've seen a lot of people, they find information on the introduction of papers, and then they cite the paper because somebody referred to that in the introduction. That's not good practice. You always want to cite the data a paper is reporting to, okay? And then the objectives should also always be stated as a verb, as an action. The objectives are to, and then do X, Y, and Z. A hint is that the objective and the gap should always have the same structure. So if the gap is about the benefits of LSR, as we're saying here, are controversial, the objective is to investigate the benefits of LSR. They should always have the same graphic, the same structure, the same narrative, because then it means that you're tied together. It means that you are working with something that makes sense. Okay, the literature, the narrative of the introduction makes sense. So the literature review and the gap should have 1 to 2 paragraphs, and hypothesis and objective should be 1 paragraph. So it means that your introduction should not be more than 5 paragraphs, and it should be at least 3 to 4 paragraphs, each paragraph with a very particular structure. So this for me is a very good guidance in size, because every time I write an introduction for the first time, it's going to have 7, 8 paragraphs, because I'm just putting ideas out. Now, once I'm reviewing what I've written, then I know that I need to have 1 paragraph. It helps me to get 2 ideas that I know are part of significance and putting them together in a more concise way. In 1 paragraph that has 3 to 4 sentences that are very important sentences, much more important than if I've used a lot of synonyms, a lot of adjectives to write it into 2 paragraphs. Okay, so use that as a guide. It will help you to trim down, to strengthen, to shorten your argument, and making it all easier for a reader to review. Okay? Questions so far?
I have a couple.
Yes, go for it.
So, in my work, I do a lot of my stuff is theoretically based, and I have to, for most of the journals, include some type of theory. Does that go in information? No, does that go in the literature review section? Like when you have to bring in theory or actually state what the theory is on in your work, is that literature review?
I would put it on literature review. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
And
And that goes back a little bit when you have to specify the theory you're working on. In the paper, you don't want to spend too much time teaching people what the theory is. So you basically want to say, I'm using this theory, and this is how I'm operationalizing this theory in my question, right? And so it can be a little bit more direct, but yes, you would put it on literature review. Yes. Okay.
And then my second question, for journals that have a really, really stringent word count, and 4 or 5 paragraphs may be a lot, can you combine information gap and literature review? Like how would you restructure this, I guess, for those journals that have that tight word count?
Yeah, I would combine significance and information gap.
Okay.
So that I would end the significance paragraph with the information gap.
Okay.
And then I would try to simplify the literature review. These journals are usually journals that are not going to take a lot of psych and disparities and inequities papers, because these papers need a lot of literature, a lot of theory to support them. They're going to be very health oriented, where you just like state the facts and answer a question. But that's what I would do. I would combine significance and information gap.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the objectives can be as much as 1 line if you need, right? 2 lines if you need at tops.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so as I said, these videos kind of guide through the writing, but I just want to do 2 exercises here, and then I'm going to delete these later, so I'm just going to use the same word that I have here. But let's work on an introduction. And what I always do when I'm writing something, and I'm one, you all know me very well, I'm a very anxious person, and my anxiety coping mechanism is procrastination and avoidance. So there you go. What I do is I have a very hard time starting things. Very hard time starting things. So what I do is I use these templates to push me through, because it allows me to, for me, I've learned to deal with procrastination. If I do small things that I can complete them fast, it starts to build up my energy and motivation, and then I can take on a larger challenge. So for me, having templates and start wordsmithing around the templates is much easier than blocking an hour to write the entire thing. At least that's how I work. So what I always do is I start and I get the blank page. And the way to deal with this psychological syndrome called the anxiety of the blank page is a name I put is not on DSM, but it will one day, is I start writing the template. So I put our introduction and I start significance, gap, literature review, objectives. And so once I map those out, then what I do is I go from the one that I have start from fresh. We usually start a project knowing what we're going to do. Oops. So we kind of always know what the objective is because we start a project already thinking about a question I want to answer. So I either write the objective or write the gap. I like to write the objective first because it allows me to put some ideas here. So I want to do an exercise. Who's writing something now that they would like to showcase this? Anyone? Any paper you guys are writing now? Or any projects you're working on?
Okay, I can go. I mean, I'm about
Yeah.
to start working on the intro for the mediation moderation paper.
Perfect. Let's do that. So let's go through the objective for the moderation mediation paper. Do you have it there? What we laid out as objective, or have you written that already?
No, I haven't
All
written
right.
anything yet.
So let's put this together. So the goal for this paper is to I'm going to write something up, and this is also very important for me, is just write what's in your mind, and later you wordsmith. Don't try to make it very nice as you're thinking it through, because it also clutters your mind, right? So I'm just going to put something here. It's not going to be good, but we'll clean it up later. Okay. So to evaluate the moderation effect of I don't know,
So like,
X
so like practice
variables,
intervention. Oh, okay.
efficacy of the PPK
Intervention.
intervention on reducing harmful alcohol use. Okay, I've just written something. It's not good, but I've written something and it centers me on what I want to do. Okay. You see that I already had some struggle here saying what are the variables. And this is going to be a struggle for you on your writing, Kiana, because this is a paper that tries to condense a lot of things together. So the writing here is going to be a little tricky. But so here we can say to evaluate the moderation effect of social demographic, clinical, and injury characteristics on the efficacy of the PPK intervention on reducing. Okay, it's not great, but it's fine. It's there. So I started pushing something down. So then one of the rules, maybe I should put that on the template, the rules of writing introduction. One of the rules is that the gap should have the same structure. So I always copy it there. And now I'm going to wordsmith the gap, because I want the gap to really talk to the objective. Okay. So then the gap to this project, or something that I'm trying to evaluate here, is, and this is me thinking out loud, is that there's an intervention to, yes, Cyrus. Is that for me, or are you talking to someone there?
Sorry, Ja, you're good.
Okay, all right. So what the argument here is that there's this intervention to improve alcohol use in Tanzania, but there are some conditions or some characteristics that might influence how this intervention is impacting harmful alcohol use, and we don't know that. So then that's what the gap's gonna be. So the gap is going to be, I'm gonna write something up in the structure of a gap, and then we can always wordsmith, but I will say something like, while PPK has, while PPK has shown to improve alcohol consumption. And here you see that I'm already improving my writing as I go, because now I'm using alcohol consumption and not harmful use, because that's what our outcomes are. So later I have to change here to match here, and I'm kind of improving as I go. So while PPK has shown to improve alcohol consumption behavior, the effect of PPK among different populations are yet not reported. I'm just going to write it this way, and then we can improve it better. But here I'm basically saying I want to evaluate the moderation effect of some characteristics. At some point, I might want to further specify what I say by different populations. But then this brings me back to what am I going to have to talk about to justify this? So the arguments, so again, I'm going to get my gap and put it in the literature review. And now I'm going to break this down into key constructs that I have to talk about in the literature review to support the gap. So the first key concept is that PPK has shown to improve alcohol use behavior. So I have to make a literature review about this. The second key part is that the effect of PPK could be different among different populations. But why am I saying that? So basically here I have to say that previous studies on BNI showed differential effects for social demographics, for levels of alcohol use, for mental health predictors, or others. So now I know exactly what I have to write about in the literature review. And here I'm just writing this structure based on my mind. Of course, I have a lot of reading around this area, so I probably can sketch this a little easier than Kiana will, because she's getting to this now. But I'm just taking the argument and I'm breaking the argument down in the aspects of the introduction. So now if I have the gap, now let me go back to the significance. And so the key pieces that I'm talking about here in the gap are alcohol use. So I have to say, why is this a problem? The second piece of this is that PPK works. So why is this a solution? And then finally, I then have the gap, right? So then in the significance, I can start coming here and say, well, if my topic is about alcohol, then I'm going to focus on alcohol. And I could start sketching my significance to say something like, alcohol use is among the, I'm just going to write something up. It's among the highest burden of disease leading, there's a much better way to write this, but yeah, leading risk factor. Oh, let me change this. Alcohol use is the leading risk factor for injury, is the leading modifiable risk factor for injury, and has a disproportionate impact in low and middle income countries. About, and I don't know the number, so I'm just going to guess a number, okay? About 90% of the injuries seen at low and middle income countries emergency departments are linked to alcohol use. Addressing alcohol use. And then I'll just write something. So I could easily write up 3 or 4 sentences just out of my mind to sketch what this would look like. So this is an exercise that you can do. And then when you come to our first meeting to discuss the project concept, this is already in your paper skeleton. And being on the paper skeleton, it means that this can help you lead the discussion with your peers, with your mentors. And then as the discussion progresses, you add up information here to help you write this stuff now. Okay? Now, this also helps you later when you're going to do literature review. So instead of you doing a bunch of literature review prior to writing, I really enjoy the idea of you sketching the writing and then doing focused literature review. That's part of the concepts of doing agile literature review that I always talk about as well. So if I sketched my introduction to have this structure, it means that now I have to find data that helps me fit this information here. And then I'm going to read 1, 2 papers around this, and then I'm going to wordsmith this sentence. Then I have to find data that helps me write this section here. I have to find data that gives me this number. So I'm not going to search in the Google for alcohol use papers in Tanzania. I'm going to look for alcohol use prevalence in injury. And it helps me streamline, it helps me focus my systematic review, my review, not systematic review, my literature review. Okay? Similarly, I have ideas of what kind of papers I'm going to search if I want to write about this as well. Okay?
I have a question. So at what
Yes.
point do you bring in like Tanzania? Because if that's in the objectives, if that's the first time I'm seeing that in the objectives, does it need to be?
That's a great point. I would definitely bring Tanzania here. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going into detail, but I would definitely bring it here. So when I'm saying alcohol is linked to a bunch of injuries in LMICs, here's
and
when I
then bring it
say
down to
in
Tanzania. Okay, got it.
Or Tanzania. Tanzania is the leading East African country in alcohol use, or something like that.
Okay, got it.
Our previous work in Tanzania showed, and then you say what it showed.
Okay.
And then you would end, addressing alcohol use at the emergency department has shown to be an effective intervention in high income countries, and the results from our trial at KCMC showed blah, blah, blah.
Got it.
And then you say, but why, which showed, and then you link it to the gap, right? So maybe this could even be part of the gap. You could have these 2 structures here.
Okay.
Right?
Yep. Got it.
Okay. Cool. So that's kind of what I wanted to work with you on this and guide you through. I'm going to stop recording.